This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this week's episode of Roots and All, where I'm talking with Jack Willgoss, who along with wife Laura runs Wildegoose Nursery in Shropshire, where they hold the Bouts collection of Violas. The collection comprises over 160 varieties and includes some favourites which date back to the 1800s. Jack talks about his collection, the different types of violas you might come across, and how you can best grow them in your garden, either in the ground or in containers. Jack begins by explaining how he and Laura came to be custodians of the collection.
Basically what happened was my now wife, Laura, and I were working as private gardeners, and we were working for big households as sole gardeners and weren't really enjoying it, and decided that we'd start to put together a plan on starting a plant nursery. And it was sort of a dream, a pipeline dream that we'd always had, that one day we'd start a plant nursery, perhaps have a garden alongside it, and it would showcase the plants that we so loved. So we're really in love with late season perennials, ornamental grasses and things like that. And we wanted to create this nursery that would be a proper nursery in the true old-fashioned sense. So we'd be propagating everything ourselves. Everything that we sold would be tried and tested. And so we sort of had this plan, and we were starting to think of when we were going to do it, how we were going to do it, and so on and so forth. And at the time, we were customers of a nursery called Bouts Cottage Nursery, and they specialised in perennial violas. And I started to build this small collection of violas, really with the idea that obviously I liked them, but also when we did start the nursery, they'd be really a good block of colour early on in the season and a bit of earlier interest. And we were at a plant fair, so this is way back in 2011, just there as customers, and Mark Roberts from Bouts Cottage was there, and I was asking him lots of questions, sort of, when would he be taking his cuttings, where would he overwinter them, which varieties would he really recommend? And he sort of said to me, "Oh, you're a bit too keen just to be an amateur." And I said, "Oh, well, actually, I'm a professional gardener, and we've got this plan that one day we want to start our own plant nursery, and I'd really like to grow a few violas." And he said, "Oh, for goodness sake," he said, "I've been trying to retire for 2 years. How's about, we come to some sort of agreement and you can take on my nursery?" And that was in May 2011. And after sort of going to see the nursery and have lots of discussions, we finally took it on in the August of 2011. And it was big collection, purely perennial violas, absolutely everything that we didn't want the nursery to be, because I didn't want to have a monoculture. I didn't want to have a big collection of anything. I wanted to have this sort of really diverse group of plants. And so it sort of forced us into having a nursery and made us make that leap from paid employment to having our own nursery. But central to it was this huge collection of violas.
That was very serendipitous then, I must say.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there, that was a later question, but I'm going to ask it now. So you mentioned perennial violas.
Yeah.
What's the difference? I'm assuming there are annuals and perennials.
Yeah, so this will probably take a bit of time to explain, but so basically the violas that we grow derived from two different species. So you've got Viola cornuta, which I'm sure quite a few people listening to this might grow it, or they might grow Viola cornuta alba. And Viola cornuta is a species from high up in the Pyrenees. And where it grows up in the Pyrenees, it's growing in perennial meadowland. And the plant produces a really sort of dense basal crown which has got a real perennial habit. I mean, it can live for years and years and years. And in these meadows, it's growing amongst it's growing in poor grassland, high altitudes. So it's used to quite harsh weather, and that makes it a really hardy plant. So that hardy perennial Viola cornuta is one of our parents in our collection, and the other parent is Viola lutea, which is actually a British native, and it grows in the Shropshire Hills, so not far from the nursery. And again, it's growing at quite high altitudes, where again it's going to get quite adverse weather conditions. So it's really hardy. Again, it's perennial, producing this dense crown, but also the flowers are really scented. So that's where we bring the scent into the collection. So that's what forms the base of our collection: Viola cornuta and Viola lutea. The bedding violas that you get are very similar to pansies in that they are derived mainly from Viola tricolour or heartsease. So Viola tricolour, British native again, bit of an arable weed really, but that's been bred over about 200 years to produce these sort of bedding plants, which are, they're annual, maybe biennial. But it's when you look back at Viola tricolour is a biennial at best, whereas the two species we're growing from are really truly perennial plants.
Excellent. Well, that is very good. Thank you. That's very illuminating. I might just throw another small curveball to people, and that is that you mentioned on your website Violettas. Are they different again?
Yeah, so Violettas, again, they're perennial and their parentage is similar to the rest of the collection. But Violettas arose about 1910. So perennial violas and the hybrids started to appear about the 1870s. Before that, the breeding had all been about pansies. So from about 1820 to 1870, all the breeding is about pansies. 1870 onwards, we start to see the introduction of these perennial violas. And then about 1910, this is really when the growing of perennial violas is at its absolute peak. It's sort of like real craze level growing. And there was a gardener who was growing lots of violas, and he decided that he'd grow some from seed to see which varieties, if he could produce some new varieties. And one of these seedlings that appeared seemed to be really quite interesting because it was a very compact plant. It didn't get much more than about 10 or 15 centimetres in diameter. And it was quite short, so it didn't get much more than about 15 centimetres high. And the flowers on this plant were almost perfectly round, sort of a perfect circle, absent of any rays. So if you look at a viola or a pansy, they've often got the sort of these cat's whiskers around the central eye. Well, in a violetta, they're completely gone, and also has fantastic fragrance. So this was what was this plant that he'd grown. So he thought it was really quite special and quite distinct. He took some cuttings off of it and sent them to William Robinson at Graveside Manor. And William Robinson invited him for tea. They had this great long discussion about this plant and decided that it was so distinct and so superior that it should be a separate group of plants altogether. So they called it a violetta. Some people maybe grow Viola Rebecca. It's quite a common variety, a blue and white striped variety. That is actually a violetta. So really, in short, they're compact plants, rounded flowers, no rays, and intense fragrance.
Right. So the ones that you grow that are in your collection on your website, what species would they be then if they're a cross between the cornuta and the lutea?
So they don't really have a species name because the breeding is so diverse. So you've got cornuta and lutea form the base, but then within that you might have the odd pansies being crossed in, or a bigger flowered hybrid has been crossed in. So we don't have a species, so to speak, or a cross. We just call them viola hybrids.
Did you know how convoluted this was before you got into it?
I know there's a whole book on it, but it's a bit of a tangled web.
If they are so promiscuous in terms of cross-pollinating, or it sounds like they are they relatively easy to breed? And do they self-sow?
Yeah, they do. So, I mean, we get lots of seedlings appearing, and we have to be really careful with making sure we weed out those seedlings. Otherwise, quite often what you find is a very vigorous seedling will outcompete the parent plant. So to overcome that, it's regular deadheading, making sure our stock pots are really weeded. But because the parentage is so diverse, you could sow a pink viola and it will come out as a deep purple or something. There's no real telling what you're going to get. And because we grow them all together sort of in stock pots in one section of the nursery, the bees quite happily do a lot of crossbreeding for us. And we get some interesting seedlings appear that we might then grow on to see whether they're worth naming or not.
So you mentioned pink there. I saw on your website that your range seems to be sort of favouring the blues and the yellows. Is that because of the parentage of the plants?
Yes, I mean, most colours, so most of them are blues, yellows, whites. We have a few pink varieties. Pink's quite rare. And although we grow quite a few of them, a lot of them aren't particularly robust and hardy. But you don't get oranges and reds like that. You don't really have that within the parent range to get that going through in the hybrids.
Mm-hmm. And so your particular violas, are they suitable for growing in the ground in the garden, or are they better in containers?
So we divide the collection up really, because there are varieties that are absolute fantastic border stalwarts, and so lots of the Viola cornuta cultivars. Particular favourite of mine is Lorna Cawthorn, absolutely superb variety, brilliant for the front of the border. You've also got things like Eastgrave Blue, Inverary Beauty, Alethea, which are larger flowered hybrids, but have got enough vigour that they can go at the front of the border. They're going to create these nice big clumps. Things like Violettas and the more compact violas, I wouldn't put at the front of the border. They haven't got the vigour to compete and to create a presence in the border. If you're planting something at the front of the border, you want it to be really showy. And some of the more vigorous varieties will do that, but these more compact ones, they're much better suited to go in a pot where they'll create a really beautiful display.
I'm assuming that they like, you said about them growing in meadows at high altitude. Do they like quite a well-draining soil, or again, are they quite versatile in that respect?
So generally speaking, we say they've got two things that they hate, and that is sitting wet in the winter and drying out in the summer. And so positioning them, you have to sort of really bear that in mind. The nursery is on improved clay over limestone, and they really like that. I think the fact that it's an improved clay means the soil's a little bit heavier, so therefore it's going to retain moisture through the summer months, but then the limestone aids drainage through winter, so the soil doesn't sit too wet. One thing I would say, though, is that it's trying to keep the violas cool. They don't like hot summers. And so, especially if you're down in the southeast, where you get a lot hotter and drier summers than we do in Shropshire, although that seems to be changing, then they need to be in dappled shade, and they would need plenty of moisture through the summer months. Here in Shropshire, we can get away with full sun, but we're finding our summers are getting much hotter and much drier, and so we're starting to move them more into the partial shade. And also by growing them in partial shade, the colours become more intense. So like the really pale blues and the pale yellows, the colour will show up better in that partial shade, whereas in full sun, we find those colours start to bleach out.
Do you need to give them a supplementary feed if they're in the garden?
If they're in the garden, we generally don't feed them. If you're on like a heavy soil, I would incorporate some organic matter when you plant them, or if you're on very sandy soil, I'd do that as well. But I wouldn't supplementary feed them in the garden. They don't get watered in our garden. They just get left to their own devices. If they're in pots, it's a different matter. We would be giving them a balanced liquid feed on a weekly basis in the growing season. So from about beginning of April through to middle of September, we would give them a feed every 7 to 10 days, something like Maxi Crop, just a balanced liquid feed, just to sort of to keep them in peak condition.
I mean, I have Viola tricolour in the garden, which I started off growing from seed, and then it just went everywhere. I have noticed that will behave like a perennial, particularly we've got a polytunnel, so it sows itself in there and stays over winter. What it does seem to do, though, is get the black spots on the leaves. Is that a common problem with all violas, or is it just that one?
No, so that's Viola black spot, so it's a soil-borne pathogen, and it's worse in sort of humid weather. So if we get sort of a hot, humid summer, we find that the black spot is worse. within our collection, there are certain cultivars that are worse for it, and we generally don't offer those for sale because I don't really want people to be growing things that are going to get smothered in black spot. Use something like SP Plant Invigorator, which almost puts like an invisible film over the foliage and helps protect the pathogens getting into contact with the foliage and keeps them clean. And that, I think, I'm pretty sure it's still certified for organic use. I mean, if you're not an organic gardener, and I don't really like talking about sort of splashing chemicals around the garden, but something like Rose Clear will get rid of it. But 9 times out of 10, we just sort of live with it and just sort of look towards the varieties that are less prone to it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned they flower generally from April till September. Would you do any cutting back at any point of the plants?
Yeah, so we shear back twice. And by shear back, I mean, even if they're still in full flower, we take them back to about 2 or 3 inches. And the first time we do this is sort of midsummer. So as the season warms up and we get sort of this hotter weather, we find that the growth becomes very sappy and they get quite leggy, and then they'll start to collapse and look quite untidy, having looked really tidy through the spring. So about June, July time, we'd shear them back, give them a liquid feed, and they'll be back up in flower in about 3 to 4 weeks. And the second time we shear them back, which is the most important time, is the middle of September. So, I mean, if we're having a mild autumn, they would carry on flowering right the way through, sort of even to November. But we shear them back in September. Otherwise, they would sort of flower themselves to death. So shear them back in mid-September. They'll put up lots of nice new growth that will then bring them through the winter. And then that's the flowering growth to start off next year.
Presumably that doesn't harm them in any way or kind of sabotage their chances of getting through the winter. I'm assuming they're very frost tolerant.
They're frost tolerant. I mean, that's really the key to getting them through the winter, because if you don't shear them back, they exhaust themselves. They haven't put up that nice new foliage to come through the winter. And that's 9 times out of 10 the reason that people would lose them in the winter is because they didn't shear them back before. But you'll find that mid-September, there's plenty of time for the new shoots to get nice and tough to bring them through the winter.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. So I think you mentioned as well scent. Are all of yours scented?
No, some of them just some of the varieties seem to come out with no scent whatsoever. But there's about half of them, at least, I would say, that have got scent in varying degrees. Quite often the yellows are really strongly scented, and the whites and the purples less so. Some of them just I can't smell anything on them at all. So you sort of have to. It's sort of either read in depth the catalogue, which should tell you which ones have got really good scent, or come to the nursery and give them a good sniff, and you can work out which ones smell the best.
Okay. I mean, on that subject, my grandmother, who's 95, always tells me about picking violets when she was a child, and I don't know which ones she was picking. Have you got any idea what that was?
I would have thought it would be sweet violets or Parma violets. I would have thought sort of Viola odoratas. I think traditionally they were the ones that they picked. I think those and Parma violets, so slightly different to ours, sort of spring flowering woodland flowers, really.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, talking of Parma violets, I think you mentioned on your website as well that they're edible. Is that the case with all the flowers that you grow?
All of the violas we grow are edible. I personally would steer more towards the smaller flowered varieties, things like Delicia, Desdemona, some of the cornutas. Whereas if you go towards some of the bigger varieties like Josie and East Grove Blue, you're going to have this great big flower on the plate. So then you sort of need to break it up into the individual petals. But they're not going to send your taste buds alike. They sort of don't taste of much at all, really. But that means they're quite versatile.
Well, they certainly look lovely. I mean, I don't know how you don't fall in love with every single one of them. I would have 50 favourites. I mean, they are all gorgeous. How do you kind of pick the ones as well that you're going to save? If mine was seeding around, I would just go, no, I've got to have them all. I love them all.
I think when we first started, perhaps we were like that. But I think as we've gone on, we've become a lot harder. And I always say to people, I'm a gardener first and a nurseryman second. And so I'm really looking at a plant as to whether it's a really good plant and whether the whole package is good. So it's all well and good saying it's got a beautiful flower, but if it's got a really bad habit or it's really prone to black spot, I don't want to grow it because I don't want to have to put chemicals on or sprays on to keep it looking good. I don't want to have to keep trimming it back and pinching it to keep it standing upright. What I want is something that might have a good sized flower, quite long stems, good scent, clean foliage. And if I want it in a pot, nice and compact, or a good vigorous one to go in the border. And I think, to me, that's what's, that those nursery people that are selecting varieties, and that's what I really want them to be doing. And that's what I think we should be doing is selecting plants that stand the test of time. I think all too often we're sort of introducing plants and naming plants that actually are not an improvement on what we've already got. And I think perhaps being a little more critical would be beneficial.
Yeah, very well said. I agree. Just to leave us, when would people buy these? When's the best time to buy them? And indeed, if they wanted, as you mentioned, to look through your catalogue or to browse your collection, where would they go to do that?
So the best place to go, well, two best places. Go on the website, which is wildegoosenursery.co.uk. That's got all of the violas on there at the moment, and we're now taking orders for delivery late April, early May. Otherwise, they can visit the nursery, and really sort of early May to mid-May is the best time to see the viola stock. And I'm doing a few plant fairs around and about. I'm doing things like Great Dixter, and a couple in the Cotswolds. But the best place to go is on the website first. That will show you the whole range. And then if you're local to Shropshire, then you can come to the nursery and see them in the flesh.
Thank you to Jack for taking part in this episode and for talking all about the collection of violas. My apologies, as by the time this episode airs, the Great Dixter Plant Fair will have passed. But hopefully you can still see the Bouts violas at another plant fair, at the nursery, or you can take a look at wildegoose.nursery.co.uk. The links are in the show notes as always. Thanks to you for listening. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about gardens as stepping stones.
Over recent years, it's become clear that Britain's biodiversity, in particular our insects, are in dramatic decline. Not just because of global warming, climate change and insecticides, but from the sustained destruction of their natural habitats. And this will be all too obvious to those of us who remember the summers from not that long ago, when our seasonal weather was a lot more predictable, and when the countryside was where we could see many species of wildlife that have now become scarce. And perhaps we'll also remember visiting those unique habitats too, such as the natural ponds and the wildflower meadows, of which over 90% have been destroyed since the 1950s. And with those habitats, many of the things that typified a beautiful summer's day in the country have gone too, such as watching hundreds of orange, brown and blue butterflies bobbing and weaving amongst the carpets of brightly coloured wildflowers, whilst overhead little chains of white butterflies snaked and swirled like kite tails, accompanied by the natural vibrato of buzzing bees, chirping grasshoppers, and trilling skylarks somewhere up amongst the wispy white clouds. So it's understandable that the problems occurring within the natural world are not only sad to see, but very worrying too. However, it is now accepted that Britain's biodiversity is in serious decline, and that long-term solutions are needed to redress it. But the good news is that all across the British Isles, a great deal of work is already being done to protect and conserve our native species, and that within the 411 official nature reserves and the many ongoing rewilding projects where natural habitats are protected, a biodiverse ecosystem does start to reform. But despite this encouraging news, there is still one important aspect that has to be addressed, And that's to bridge the gaps between these protected natural habitats so that the species within them can disperse and interbreed and not just remain as geographically isolated populations. And so within Britain's nature recovery plans, there's projects to connect the habitats by creating networks of tree and wildflower corridors, along which wildlife from protected zones can safely migrate to new locations. But this is also where any one of Britain's 23 million home gardens could help too, by becoming a stepping stone that wildlife can safely use on their journeys between the protected habitats, a place that provides easy access to food, shelter, water, and a chemical-free environment where nature's food chains can establish. Simply by having as many plants as feasibly possible, a succession of nectar and pollen-producing flowers throughout the year, and by accepting that the herbivorous creatures that we call the plant pests are the bottom level of the food chain and are the vital food source for many others.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.